Happy Sunday. We are on well, okay, maybe it's not Sunday for you. Module 29, Biology, Cognition, and Learning. We're just really going to look at, quite simply, what are the limitations that we might have based on our biological predispositions, like the nature side of us, and then also looking at what are the cognition components like that can enhance our learning are also limited. And when we talk about cognition, remember, we're always talking about our thinking patterns, all right? Whether it's our thinking or an animal's thinking. And also remember, with this particular module, we are focusing on classical conditioning responses and operant conditioning responses. All right, so we just want to recognize that there was in the early classical conditioning experiments, and there was a point where many of the researchers just thought that associations, whatever you are going to be connecting and making an association to, that it would just be, they would all be equally strong associations. But we found that that was not true. So one other thing we want to recognize that with that we have predispositions. We know biologically we have predispositions. They help enhance our survival. We a lot of times call this, from the evolutionary phenomenon, called preparedness. So there are certain things built inside of us to help prepare us to respond to an environmental stimuli. And it's good that we have that. We need to have it naturally to help us adapt. We also always want to remember, whenever we're talking about whatever behavior we're learning, and it is very complex, there's biological components, there's psychological components, and there's social cultural. Let's repeat: bio, psycho, social. We are not simple, we are complex. The first piece of research that we are going to see is and we are going to specifically be talking about classical conditioning right now and the biological processes. John Garcia was a researcher, and he did not like that many people were saying that associations were all learned equally well. So he worked with rats, which we tend to do in psychology. There's a lot of research working with rats. And he exposed a group of rats to a particular taste, sight, or sound, and later also to radiation or drugs that led to nausea or vomiting. So they made an association with getting sick. And so exposed the group of rats to the taste. And it was actually, I will tell you, it was saccharin water. Saccharin water rats actually naturally really enjoy, like to drink it, but he tainted it with a drug that made them nauseous. And so they developed what we call, it's called a taste aversion. They developed a taste aversion. So when you have something that makes you sick, you start to avoid it, or it actually even just makes you sick when you taste it, even when it's not tainted. And that's what happened to these rats, that they became aversive to the saccharin water, to the taste, but they also tried to get them to connect, to make an association with like a sound, and then the presentation of the saccharin water, and then feeling nauseous. But the key thing you want to remember here is that he noticed the taste aversion was the strongest association. So meaning the taste itself of the saccharin water, not just the sound, of a bell beforehand or something like that. So when it comes to you and your own potential taste aversions, you can think of something. I'll tell you a story. My daughter, I remember she had the stomach flu, and we were eating meatballs. And it actually wasn't the meatballs that were tainted, but she now made that association that the meatballs would make her sick. So tasting the meatballs would make her feel sick, even when she didn't have the flu or stomach virus. But that association, that connection to the taste of the meatballs themselves, was a much stronger connection, association, than maybe me just saying meatball to her, or, oh, we're gonna have meatballs tonight. Maybe she might feel a little nauseous because she's, made that connection, but it's not going to be as strong of an association as the taste itself. So think of your own examples. Here's one more example. There was some coyotes and wolves that were tempted into eating sheep carcasses that were laced with poison, and they developed an aversion to the sheep meat. But then two of the wolves with live sheep actually became afraid of the sheep too. So they certainly were making these connections and associations. And those are adaptive responses, right? If something you know is potentially going to hurt you, you're going to be afraid of it or want to avoid it. So always be thinking in each of these instances what the unconditioned stimulus is, make your little chart, which we taught you early on, the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and the conditioned response. We're going to look at another example here. This one is personal in the sense, well, actually not with me personally, but I've certainly had family members, and you may have as well. That if someone has cancer and they are going to receive chemotherapy, and they go each week to the doctor's office, and they sit in the waiting room, and then they receive the chemotherapy, and then they, we know that side effect is nausea and getting sick. But what unfortunately happens is, the unconditioned stimulus is the drug and the nausea unconditioned response, but now the waiting room has become an association with receiving the chemotherapy causing the nausea. So then just the mere sitting in the waiting room is going to create that conditioned response of nausea. And you can probably think of other classical conditioning experience that you've had that might be similar. Maybe, hopefully you have not had to have chemotherapy or any of those things. All right, so that was talking about classical conditioning. We also need to make sure that we talk about operant conditioning when it comes to biological constraints. So here's a quote: "Never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and it annoys the pig." And the point here is that you can't really teach a pig to sing because of their biology. So you're going to waste your time and he's not going to like it. And yeah, so there are going to be certain things that when it comes to it doesn't matter how many rewards and positive reinforcers that you provide, that they're not going to be able to learn it. If I tried to train my dog to balance, it would be really difficult for her to balance a book on her head, but it's really easy to train her to lay down, because that's something she naturally does. Here's an example. Pigeons can easily be conditioned to flap their wings to avoid being shocked, and to peck to obtain food. Fleeing with their wings and eating with their beaks are natural pigeon behaviors. But having a pigeon peck to avoid a shock is not like a natural thing. It would be much more difficult for them to learn that. So they talk more specifically about this thing called instinctive drift, and you know what an instinct is. So it's the tendency of learned behavior to gradually revert to biologically predisposed patterns. So meaning you might actually be able to train an animal to do something, but then naturally they just start going back to their old ways. So here we have pigs conditioned to pick up large wooden dollars and deposit them in a piggy bank, begin to drift back to their natural ways. Their more natural way is to push things with their snout. And because they just instinctually like to do that all the time, you see them playing in the mud and stuff like that, that they actually would even avoid getting their reinforcer because they just were going back to their instinctual way. So that was biology and the biological processes. Another thing we need to talk about is cognition. Cognition is your thinking patterns. Pavlov and Watson originally just didn't even put into consideration. They weren't even thinking about thinking. They just thought that you could just kind of condition people to naturally do things almost unconsciously, but cognition plays a huge role. Robert Rescorla and Alan Wagner showed that an animal can learn predictability of an event. So meaning they know and they can predict, and that level of thinking, maybe they're not as conscious and they're not necessarily conscious of it, but that expectancy is going to make the associations that much stronger. That's a thinking process. All right, so just think of your animals are going to make really strong connections when they can predict, like I said, time of day, things like that. So here's an example, how associations can influence our attitudes. When British children viewed novel cartoon characters alongside with ice cream or Brussels sprouts, they came to prefer the ice cream associated with characters. And by the way, I actually really like Brussels sprouts, so I kind of don't understand and relate to this. But the key here is that they were making associations based on their own preferences. Okay, so this one's early in classical conditioning research. They were like, oh my gosh, we're going to help so many people, especially people with addictions, because if they, let's say, are addicted to alcohol, all we have to do is put them in an experimental environment, taint the alcohol with something that makes them sick, and then they're going to avoid the alcohol, and then we're going to be done with this whole addiction issue. Unfortunately, we have cognition, we have, higher level critical thinking ability. And what they did was that because people know that in that particular environment that they had alcohol that was tainted, that made them sick, that they know that not in every case is that going to happen because of their higher level cognition thinking patterns. They can't necessarily be just completely classically conditioned to avoid alcohol, especially if they have a really strong addiction, which is unfortunate because it does reduce the treatment's effectiveness. So we just recognize, obviously, that cognition plays a role, biology plays a role. And here's another example of cognition. I'm going to tell you two terms and then I'll explain the experiment for you. So there's something called a cognitive map, and it's a mental representation of the layout of one's environment. So right now you could just be thinking about, if you're in a particular room watching this video, I want you to think of the layout of another room in your house and notice how you can mentally just kind of visualize it. All right. So that's the first term. And like I said, I'm going to explain the experiment after. The other term you need to know is something called latent learning. And that is learning that it's like you learned something, but you didn't really know you learned it until you actually have an incentive or reason to show that you learned it. So latent is kind of, the word latent kind of means hidden. So it's like your learning is hidden. All right, so let's explain this example, and then both of those terms will make a lot more sense. All right, so in a classic experiment, rats in one group repeatedly explored a maze, always with food reward at the end. The rats in the other group explored the maze with no food reward. All right, but once given a food reward at the end, the rats in the second group therefore ran the maze as quickly as the always rewarded rats. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that the rats that even weren't given a food reward, and they're kind of wandering through the maze, they had actually learned how to go through the maze, but they didn't really have a real incentive to run through the maze because they didn't know they were going to get a food reward. So the researchers, or Tolman and Honzik, they tend to sometimes just say Tolman. You might want to kind of remember their names too. So they recognized that first off, they had created a cognitive map, a mental representation, obviously, of that maze, because they were able to get themselves through it. And they also had demonstrated latent learning, because initially we couldn't really tell that they had learned to go through the maze because they didn't have an incentive. But once they did, it showed their learning. Here's a personal example for you guys. Maybe sometimes, like, hopefully not this class, not this class, but you might say some things like, oh, I didn't learn anything in that class. And then you're playing Trivial Pursuit one night, and you're just like spieling off all of the answers and knowing, and it came from your math class. And you just realize that, wow, you must have had some latent learning there. You kind of were learning things in the math class, but you didn't really have a real incentive. Maybe like it was an easy A, so you didn't have to do a lot of work or something. But then when you had an incentive to basically, win this Trivia Pursuit game, you showed what you had actually learned. All right, latent learning involves cognition. The point to remember, there is more to learning than associating a response with a consequence. There's also cognition, thinking. You're thinking about things. Here's another example. There is something called insight learning, and that's the sudden realization of a problem solution, and it contrasts with strategy based. So we also just recognize that sometimes you just kind of, you know how you work on it. And here's another example, math. I feel like this always happens with math. You're working through a math problem, you're like, oh, you're so frustrated. How do I do this? How do I do this? And then all of a sudden it comes to you. The sudden realization, that's insight learning. So here, 10-year-old Johnny Appleton's insight solved a problem that had stumped construction workers. Excuse me. How to rescue a young robin from a narrow 30-inch deep hole in a cement block. He just, all of a sudden it came to him, slowly pouring the sand, giving the bird enough time to keep its feet on top of it, constantly rising pile. Oh, that's amazing. I might have to find the video on that one. But that was insight learning. All right, woman. Oh, what did I do here? A woman had been pondering a problem for days and was about to give up when suddenly the solution came to her. Her experience can best be described as what? Insight. We can talk about a couple other things. So when we're talking about learning, you know how sometimes you feel really motivated and then you don't feel motivated to learn things? So there are two concepts here. One's called extrinsic motivation, and that's a desire to perform a behavior to receive promised rewards or avoid threatened punishment. So it's something external outside of yourself. Intrinsic motivation is a desire to perform a behavior effectively for its own sake. So think of things you really just naturally enjoy, and you're not doing it for, like, recognition, for people to tell you how great you are. You're not doing it for money. You're not doing it for grades. You just naturally enjoy doing it. Okay. Like right now, I naturally really enjoy doing the dishes and nobody's rewarding me. It's like therapeutic. I'm very intrinsically motivated to do the dishes in our house and just kind of clean our house. Extrinsic, you certainly have those things that sometimes, with school is a huge example. You're extrinsically motivated to do well, to get your GPA up. Those are all external, promised rewards for good performance. We'll talk about this more in another unit as well. Are you feeling pressured to finish your homework before a deadline, worried about your grade, eager for college credit? Then you're extrinsically motivated. If you're finding material interesting, and you start like Googling and looking up stuff on your own, and there's no grade at stake, you might be curious enough, like natural curiosity is going to be intrinsically motivated. Some of you just, reading, playing video games, those are all just things you're intrinsically motivated. How does cognitive perspective show us the limits of rewards? Promising people a reward for tasks they already enjoy can backfire. This is called the over-justification effect. Excessive rewards can destroy intrinsic motivation. I have to admit, there was one time, my husband, one year, we were really trying to get, how you get those rewards for reading, and you get to turn in, get like, you get different rewards and you could turn in your points and get a big prize or something for reading. And my husband was really trying to get our kids to read. And I remember like one Christmas, he said, it was like the month before the holiday. He said, all right, I want, if everybody reads 2 books, then, for Christmas, I'm going to give you 3 extra gifts. And they were already kind of just reading. And it actually took away, I think, it became more focused on getting the prize as opposed to just naturally enjoying to relax and read and, get into a story and, on its own. So be careful with that. And just start paying attention to what you are intrinsically motivated. And those are the things that might guide you. And those might be the things that you think about when it comes to like your career in the future and things that you're really interested in. where it doesn't feel like a job, which, I mean, I can tell you, I am very, of course, yes, it can be difficult sometimes. And yes, I do have a paycheck, which is on um, a um, fixed interval schedule. A little review there, but I really am intrinsically motivated to teach. I love working with students and all that stuff. So I really hope you guys always be paying attention, be reflecting on what's important to you. All right. So here, in experiments, children have been promised a payoff for playing with an interesting puzzle or toy. Later, they played with the toy less than the unpaid children. So there you go. There's some actual research to back up what I just said. All right, so here, what are the biological and cognitive influences on operant and classical conditioning? You do want to just remember them. Okay, we have natural predispositions that can constrain us. We also can have expectations and different thinking patterns that can enhance our learning or limit, just as I mentioned. Okay, so last thing we're going to talk about, when we're talking about learning, we also need to recognize when it comes to our own patterns of behavior and how we are trying to work through things. So in two ways do people learn to cope with personal problems. There are two ways. You can have problem-focused coping or emotion-focused coping. Problem is focusing on the problem. You attempt to alleviate the stress by changing the stressor or the way you interact with the stressor. Okay, so if you're having trouble getting your work done, in class, whether it's this class or another class, if it's a problem-focused coping, you're going to try to deal with the stressor itself. Okay. If it's emotion focused coping, you're going to attempt to alleviate the stress by avoiding or ignoring the stressor and attending to your emotional needs. So like if when you're doing your work, you don't feel bad or you start to, feel uncomfortable, that you focus on that. So then you avoid. So you can probably predict which one might. I mean, obviously your emotions are very important, but sometimes when it comes to how you're coping, we see that the problem focus might be more helpful. Last thing is this thing is called personal control. How do we feel that we are able to impact and control and have some ability to change the outcome of what's happening in our environment and in our experiences? It's our sense of impacting and directing our environment rather than feeling helpless. So there are certain things that when we are constantly in an environment where we feel like we can't control the outcome and it has a very negative outcome, we can develop something called learned helplessness. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. It's the hopelessness and passive resignation an animal or person acquires when unable to avoid repeated aversive events. There's a very famous example of a researcher that had dogs that were not able to avoid a shock, and another group of dogs, if they just jumped over a fence, they could avoid getting the shock. And what happened to the dogs that weren't able to avoid the shock, that even later on when maybe they could, they just had given up. And that's what we mean by learned helplessness. I'm going to be very serious with you for a moment. Sometimes it does happen in school. Sometimes you feel like you studied for test, you failed. You studied for test, you failed. And then you just feel like you have no control and you just kind of shut down. That would be an example of learned helplessness. But the good news is, as you've learned from those videos, hopefully, and we have one more video to get through, actually, or maybe by the time you watch this, you've already seen it. There are a lot of different strategies. And even though you feel like, and maybe you developed learned helplessness, maybe you need to go back to that problem-focused coping. And you can go back and there are other strategies that you can implement. All right. So this was the experiment I was just telling you about. So we'll skip over that. So you want to have a sense of control. We need to have it. If we are in a constant state of no control, it actually does affect us. You know, we call that stress, and it affects our immune system and things, especially over the long term. And we're going to talk about that more specifically in the stress unit, right? Captive animals experience more stress. They're more vulnerable to disease and wild counterparts. The greater the nurse's workload. Oh, this is a little too relevant to today. The higher level cortisol level and blood pressure, but only among nurses who reported little control over their environment. So you just need to have some level of control. And they even found with people that are living as they get older, you know how physically they have limitations in what they can do. But if you can give certain levels of control over their environment, it increases happiness and increases life satisfaction. Okay, so there's something called an external locus of control and an internal locus of control when we're, recognizing. When you feel that everything is completely outside of your forces, and remember, we gave you an example of learned helplessness, which would be an extreme form of it. That is called an external locus of control. Okay, obviously, when things do happen, like a natural disaster, obviously this pandemic is, something completely out of your control in the sense that, the pandemic itself happening. But when you feel like there's certain things that you do have control and that you can create your own or you just have control, you feel like there's something that you can do to change the outcome. That is called an internal locus of control. I'm going to bring this as an example when we're talking about the pandemic. Let's, be real for a minute. The external part that we can't control is there is a pandemic that is out there, okay? And then, as we see from the research, until we get the vaccine and everybody, and most of us, all of us receive the vaccine, there's that level of part of that we can't control. But we do have control over our individual decisions and what we do on a daily basis when it comes to just trying to, have some level of knowing that we are safer and less risk. And that's, as you mentioned, we talk about wearing the mask, making sure that you're social distancing and things like that. Those are some things you can control, but although there's parts of it that you can't, right? So internals, I will tell you overall, the more that you recognize your own responsibility and your own ability to control certain things, they definitely find achievement. There's a correlation. They tend to achieve more in school and work, act more independently, enjoy better health, feel less depressed. And people with internal locus of control at age 10 exhibited less obesity, lower blood pressure, and less distress. Compared with non-leaders, military business leaders have lower than average levels of stress hormones and report less anxiety thanks to their greater sense of control. Which ability is likely to predict good adjustment, better grades, and social success? Low self-control, an external locus of control, problem-focused coping, learned helplessness, emotion-focused coping. This is kind of a difficult one. But if you remember kind of early on, problem-focused coping, because if you are having this level of focusing on the problem, having some ability that maybe you can change the outcome. All right. And then there is something called self-control. We're going to watch this little video here just for fun.
We have no confirmation, but we believe FN 2187 may have helped in the escape. Anything else?
What might we call that? We might call that a temper tantrum, right? So the other thing we need to talk about when it comes to learning and our behaviors is, what is our own self-control, Like, what is self-control? It's the ability to control impulses, delay short-term gratification for long-term rewards. A number of performing artists make their living as very convincing human statues. That is just absolutely incredible. If you've ever seen some of those human statues, talk about self-control, right? Why is self-control important? It predicts good health, higher income, better school performance. In studies of American, Asian, and New Zealander children, self-control outdid intelligence test scores in predicting future academic and life success. And guess what? You have a level of control, right? So just remember that when things get tough, and I hope you have an incredibly wonderful, wonderful winter break. But sometimes things are going to get tough, and I want you to try to just, all the things that you learn in this class, obviously you learn in other, like when it comes to, your own self-care strategies that you have, just remember that, have just take a deep breath, learn how to calm down just a little bit. And our self-control sometimes varies over time, like a muscle. It tends to weaken after use, recover after rest, and go stronger with exercise. So you just need to rest as well, right? Because at some point, if you're constantly having to be in these stressful environments and you're having to have the self-control, it can get depleted. In one famous experiment, hungry people who had spent some of their willpower resisting the temptation to eat chocolate chips then abandoned a tedious task sooner than did others. All right, so wow, we covered a lot. So I hope you have an incredibly wonderful break. And I need to do a quick shout out to my coworker and friend, Ms. Trincheri, and wish her an incredibly wonderful break. And, I'm so grateful and to have her as we work together. And I don't know, I just want to do a great shout out to how thankful I am to be working with her. So, all right. And I'm thankful for the rest of you too, even those students that I don't have. So yeah, enjoy yourself. Take care. Have a great break.